In a dramatic and unexpected move, Donald Trump has issued a stern warning to Russian President Vladimir Putin, sparking intense discussions across the global political stage. As tensions between Russia and the West continue to escalate, Trump's statement has introduced a new layer of uncertainty into an already volatile situation. With the ongoing war in Ukraine and Russia's aggressive military maneuvers capturing headlines worldwide, Trump's words come at a critical time. His warning has raised questions about how the United States might approach its relationship with Russia under his potential future leadership. Could this signify a return to hardline diplomacy, or is it a calculated move to pressure Putin into rethinking his strategy? During his recent public appearances, Trump has repeatedly expressed confidence in his ability to swiftly end the Ukraine conflict, even claiming he could resolve the crisis in just 24 hours. This bold claim has drawn both praise and skepticism, but it undeniably highlights his ambition to position himself as a global dealmaker. Now, his latest remarks directed at Putin suggest he is prepared to take a tougher stance than many might have anticipated. Trump's warning comes as global powers watch Russia's actions with growing concern. From military operations in Ukraine to threats of energy disruptions in Europe, Putin's strategies have placed him at the center of global controversy. Trump's message to the Russian leader serves not only as a direct challenge but also as a signal to the international community that he intends to play a decisive role in shaping the future of this conflict. As the world watches this unfolding drama, questions linger. How will Putin respond to Trump's pointed remarks? Could this alter the trajectory of US-Russia relations? And most importantly, what does this mean for the millions affected by the ongoing war in Ukraine? Stay with us as we dive deep into Trump's nightmare warning to Putin, explore the implications for global diplomacy, and examine how this could reshape the geopolitical landscape in the months and years ahead. Trump's warning to Russia: why Putin is losing sleep. A new Financial Times report has sent shockwaves across the globe, making it clear that the upcoming Trump presidency is set to bring challenging times for Russia and Vladimir Putin. The report highlights Trump's renewed call for NATO to step up its defense spending, a move that could spell a nightmare scenario for Putin, who has long opposed the military alliance. For Putin, NATO has always been the enemy he fears most, or so he claims. Trump's push to increase NATO members' defense budgets is a direct challenge to Russia's ambitions. During his first presidency, Trump proposed doubling NATO's defense spending target from 2% to 4% of each member nation's GDP. Now, with his return to office, he's determined to turn this vision into reality. NATO's current defense spending target is 2% of GDP, but many member nations fail to meet even this baseline. Trump has criticized this as unfair, arguing that the US shoulders an outsized burden for Europe's defense. According to him, European nations, especially those closer to Russia, should be leading the charge in building up their defenses. The logic is simple: deterrence. If Russia perceives that it cannot win a war, it will never start one. This principle was starkly illustrated by the invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. At the time, Russian leaders, including Putin and his generals, believed Ukraine would fall within 3 days. This miscalculation led to a prolonged war that has now dragged on for over 1,000 days, bringing consistent bad news for Russia. When you examine the numbers, the disparity in defense spending is clear. Among NATO members, only a few, such as Poland, are meeting or exceeding the 3% mark. Poland, in fact, spends approximately 4.5% of its GDP on defense as of 2024. This level of commitment highlights Poland's understanding that the best way to deter Russian aggression is through robust military readiness. In contrast, many major European nations, including Germany, France, and the UK, consistently spend less than 2% of their GDP on defense. Trump has labeled this as freeloading, pointing out that these countries benefit from the protection provided by NATO, largely funded by US contributions, without pulling their own weight. Experts agree that Europe must confront the harsh reality of its situation. Putin's rhetoric is often contradictory, one moment calling for peace, the next declaring that Russia is at war with the world. His defense minister recently warned that Europe should prepare for conflict, possibly within the next decade. Poland has emerged as a shining example of how to address this threat, significantly increasing its defense capabilities. Mark, a geopolitical analyst, emphasized the importance of achieving not just higher spending percentages, but also advanced military systems and weaponry to ensure Europe's security. As Trump pushes for NATO reforms, the alliance faces a pivotal moment. Will European nations rise to the occasion and share the burden of defense? Or will the US continue to bear the brunt of protecting the Western world? The stakes couldn't be higher. With Trump calling for a stronger, more financially committed NATO, 2025 could be a turning point in the balance of power between the West and Russia. For Putin, this marks yet another chapter of sleepless nights as his strategic missteps come back to haunt him. Be sure to like and subscribe to stay updated on this developing story as we dive deeper into global politics and the future of NATO. You're almost at 5%, but here's where things get shocking. In a recent interview, Mark shared a startling fact: only 20% of Europe is currently covered by air defenses. That means 80% of the continent is vulnerable to the drones and missiles that Putin is sending into Ukraine, and the potential damage could be catastrophic. This brings us to the importance of defense spending. Defense budgets aren't just numbers on paper, they're investments in peace and freedom. There's no price on freedom, and that's exactly what Ukrainians are fighting for. Trump knows this, but even he admits that the 5% GDP defense spending goal might be too high. For context, even the US doesn't allocate 5% of its GDP to defense. Trump's proposal is more of an opening offer for negotiations, which he would likely adjust once in office. Analysts believe the final target could settle around 3.5%, which is still a significant increase for countries like Germany, France, and the UK. These nations, with their large economies, would need to contribute hefty sums, as noted in the report. The report also highlights that Trump is willing to be patient with these countries, giving them time to meet the new targets. Historically, during the Cold War, countries spent around 5% of their GDP on defense. While that period is often criticized for excessive military spending, it also played a key role in preventing direct conflicts. The Cold War arguably saved the world from the devastation of another world war, underscoring the necessity of robust defense budgets. Zelensky echoes this sentiment, pointing to Putin's unpredictable and dangerous behavior. For Putin, human life means nothing, and his actions prove how unhinged he is. Whether it's targeting civilians in Ukraine or silencing critics like Alexei Navalny and Yevgeny Prigozhin, Putin has consistently shown a complete disregard for human life. Zelensky emphasizes the urgency of Western support, expressing hope that Trump will help bring an end to the war. This brings us to an ironic reality. Despite Putin's vocal opposition to NATO's presence near Russia, his invasion of Ukraine has only expanded NATO's borders. Finland and Sweden, historically neutral, joined NATO after realizing that the only way to ensure their safety from Russia was to be part of the alliance. While Putin claims NATO is a threat, his actions suggest otherwise. He has left Russia's borders with Finland and Sweden largely undefended, focusing his military efforts entirely on Ukraine. Putin's real motives for invading Ukraine seem rooted in his desire to rebuild the Soviet Union, which he once called the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. But his plans have clearly gone awry. What was supposed to be a quick special military operation has dragged on for years, with Russian soldiers dying in massive numbers. Now, there are signs that Putin might be ready to compromise. At a recent press conference, Putin admitted he was open to negotiations and compromises, though he blamed Ukraine for rejecting past agreements. He referenced a supposed deal from 2022 that Ukraine initially agreed to but later withdrew from. However, this claim is part of Russia's ongoing disinformation campaign. Similar to how Russia misrepresents NATO's open-door policy, Putin twists the narrative to justify his actions. NATO does not actively seek to expand, but instead allows countries to join voluntarily. Nations like Sweden and Finland sought NATO membership only after witnessing Russia's aggression toward Ukraine. Putin's repeated claims that NATO expansion violates promises are based on nothing more than notes from informal meetings decades ago. There was never a formal agreement. Ultimately, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has backfired, strengthening NATO and uniting the West against him. As we analyze his recent remarks, it's clear that his compromises are another attempt to manipulate public opinion. On the other hand, Trump's bold approach to defense spending and his potential involvement in negotiations could reshape the geopolitical landscape. Only time will tell whether his strategies will lead to lasting peace or further conflict. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into Trump's latest moves, Putin's evolving strategies, and how these developments could shape the future of the war in Ukraine. NATO operates in a fundamentally different way from Russia. While NATO expands by welcoming countries that voluntarily seek membership, Russia resorts to aggression, deploying missiles, drones, and tanks, just to claim small parts of Ukraine, all while suffering massive casualties, nearing 1 million in this ongoing war. On another note, an important highlight from the Financial Times article is that Trump has agreed to continue funding Ukraine. His reasoning is clear: whether or not Russia is ready to negotiate, the West and Ukraine need to enter potential talks from a position of strength. If Trump were to threaten to withdraw aid, it would weaken Ukraine's ability to secure favorable terms in any future negotiations. That's why he's committed to supporting Ukraine while also urging NATO members to contribute more to the effort. The US will continue funding Ukraine, ensuring that when negotiations happen, Ukraine is in the strongest possible position to achieve the best deal. This strategy aligns with Trump's campaign promises, and his cabinet appointments provide further insight into his approach. For example, he selected General Keith Kellogg as the special envoy for the Russia-Ukraine war. Kellogg, a seasoned expert on Russian military tactics, has a clear understanding of how to handle Russia to prevent the conflict from escalating into a full-scale world war. In a recent interview, General Kellogg explained how Russia's traditional method of warfare relies on sheer numbers, similar to human wave attacks. Historically, Russia has used this strategy, notably in World War II, to overwhelm opponents through attrition. Currently, the casualty ratio between Russia and Ukraine stands at approximately 5-1, with around 350,000 to 400,000 Russian soldiers dead compared to 150,000 Ukrainian losses. After nearly 1,000 days of war and these staggering numbers, both sides may be approaching a point where stepping back and negotiating becomes the only viable option. Kellogg believes that Trump's leadership could bring the conflict to a conclusion, potentially within the year. His confidence stems from Trump's ability to make bold promises and execute them effectively. Kellogg also emphasized that Trump's administration is already working at a rapid pace, even before taking office, to lay the groundwork for achieving these goals. During a planned visit to Kyiv in January, Trump's team will focus on gathering critical information rather than setting formal policies. While they can't make official agreements before the inauguration due to legal constraints like the Logan Act, the proactive approach demonstrates Trump's commitment to fulfilling his campaign promises and addressing key issues swiftly. This attitude, what Trump's team calls Trump time, underscores their determination to deliver results for the American people. Whether in the Middle East, Europe, or Ukraine, the administration is moving quickly to address pressing global challenges. Finally, a quick note for viewers: YouTube isn't always supportive of the topics we cover, and many of our videos are restricted or demonetized. That's why we've launched memberships and Patreon to allow our audience to support us directly. If you appreciate the content we create and want to help us continue covering these important stories, you can join as a Patreon member or support us on YouTube. Links and QR codes are on the screen and in the description below. Your support means the world to us, and it ensures we can keep making the content you enjoy, regardless of advertiser preferences. Trump's push for increased NATO defense spending is a major part of his strategy for European security. He has long criticized European nations for relying too heavily on the US to defend the continent, accusing them of freeloading. As tensions with Russia have escalated, especially following the invasion of Ukraine, Trump has used this as an opportunity to demand that NATO members step up their defense contributions. Currently, NATO has a target of 2% of GDP for defense spending, but Trump has suggested that this figure should be raised, ideally to 4%. While this may seem like a bold request, it speaks to a larger issue of burden sharing within the alliance. NATO's collective defense depends heavily on US contributions, but Trump's proposal indicates that he believes European countries, particularly those bordering Russia, should take more responsibility for their own security. With countries like Poland already spending over 4% of their GDP on defense, Trump is essentially pushing for NATO to catch up with the growing threats from Russia. One of the key reasons Trump insists on higher defense spending is the proximity of European countries to Russia. Countries like Poland understand that building up their defenses is the most effective way to deter Russian aggression. The current defense spending across Europe is alarmingly low, with most NATO members not meeting the 2% targets set by the alliance. This disparity is a problem that Trump has long highlighted, suggesting that NATO members are relying too much on the US to shoulder the burden of their defense. He points to countries like Germany and France, who consistently spend less than 2%, as examples of the American freeloading problem. By pushing these countries to increase their defense budgets, Trump is aiming to make NATO a more balanced and capable alliance, one where European nations are able to defend themselves without relying on the US as the primary force. Putin's reaction to NATO's expansion and increased defense spending is telling. While he consistently claims that NATO is a threat to Russia, especially with the alliance's expansion into Eastern Europe, the actual military deployment along NATO's new borders tells a different story. Despite Russia's vocal opposition to NATO expansion, countries like Finland and Sweden, who had historically remained neutral, have joined the alliance after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This shift demonstrates that NATO's open-door policy is a response to Russian aggression rather than a proactive attempt to provoke Russia. Moreover, Russia's inability to properly defend its own borders, particularly along Finland and Sweden, shows that its focus is squarely on Ukraine, not on stopping NATO's spread. This further undermines Putin's narrative that NATO is a major existential threat to Russia. Instead, it becomes clear that the real reason for the invasion is not simply a fear of NATO, but rather Putin's desire to rebuild a greater Russia, with the fall of the Soviet Union being something he has publicly lamented. This brings us to the question of negotiations. As the war in Ukraine drags on with devastating casualties on both sides, the possibility of a negotiated settlement becomes more likely. Putin has signaled that he is ready for negotiations, although he has continuously framed the situation as Ukraine being unwilling to compromise. He has pointed to a potential deal from 2022, which Ukraine allegedly initialed, but which was ultimately abandoned. However, this narrative is part of the broader disinformation campaign that Russia has used to justify its actions in Ukraine. The reality is that NATO's expansion and Ukraine's desire for sovereignty are not negotiable for the West. Trump's stance on Ukraine has been more complicated. While he continues to support Ukraine and has promised continued U.S. aid, he also advocates for NATO members to take on more financial responsibility. His goal is to ensure that Ukraine is in the strongest possible position when negotiations with Russia eventually occur. Trump's support for Ukraine, despite calling for burden sharing among NATO members, suggests that he believes the West must maintain pressure on Russia to force them into a position where they are willing to negotiate a peaceful settlement. At the same time, Trump is keenly aware of the risks of a prolonged conflict with Russia. General Keith Cogg, a former U.S. military leader, explains that the war has become a war of attrition, with heavy casualties on both sides. The Russians, according to Cogg, are using a mass warfare approach, relying on overwhelming numbers to grind down their opponents. While this tactic may have been effective in the past, it has resulted in high casualties and an increasingly stalemated conflict. For the U.S. and NATO, this is a dangerous situation that requires a careful approach. Trump's foreign policy, especially concerning Russia, has always leaned towards ensuring that the U.S. does not get drawn into a protracted conflict. His focus on providing Ukraine with the support it needs while also pushing NATO to do more is part of a strategy that seeks to avoid further escalation while still holding Russia accountable for its actions. Zelensky's comments about Trump also reveal the delicate balancing act that Ukraine must perform. While Ukraine values U.S. support, they are also acutely aware of the need for strong leadership and a strategy that will bring the conflict to a close. Zelensky's view of Trump as a strong man, who could potentially bring about a peaceful resolution, underscores the importance of having someone at the helm in the U.S. who understands the dynamics of the situation. Zelensky, like many others, sees the current conflict as a fight for survival against a ruthless and dangerous adversary. Putin's actions in Ukraine and his willingness to go to great lengths to maintain control are proof of his dangerous mindset. This view is reflected in the rhetoric coming from both sides of the conflict, with Putin's disinformation campaigns and threats of nuclear escalation on one hand, and Zelensky's calls for international support and solidarity on the other. In conclusion, the war in Ukraine and the shifting dynamics within NATO highlight the need for a broader and more strategic approach to European security. Trump's push for higher defense spending is not just about money, it's about ensuring that Europe is capable of defending itself against future threats, especially from Russia. While Trump's stance on Ukraine remains supportive, his insistence on burden sharing among NATO members speaks to a larger issue of fairness and responsibility within the alliance. The future of NATO, Europe's security, and the resolution of the war in Ukraine will depend on the ability of Western powers to maintain unity and resilience in the face of Russian aggression. As the conflict continues, the need for a comprehensive strategy that balances military support, diplomacy, and defense spending has never been more crucial.